What if the Beatles released one more album? The Beatles were together for 8 years, from 1962, when Ringo joined the band, to early 1970. But in that short amount of time, they released an amazing amount of material. Their 13 main album releases were astonishing. Please Please Me and With the Beatles in 1963, A Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale in 1964, Help and Rubber Soul in 1965, Revolver in 1966, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Magical Mystery Tour in 1967, The Beatles, The White Album in 1968, Yellow Submarine and Abbey Road in 1969, and Let It Be in 1970. Quite impressive to say the least. Unfortunately, the Beatles broke up and the Fab Four stopped making records together. But that got me thinking, what if they stayed together? What if they released just one more final album? What would that album be called? And what songs would have been on it? My goal was to look at the albums and songs that John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr released as solo artists. Then pull out the best material that would go on this final Fantasy Beatles album. I hope that you will play this fun game with me and tell me what songs you would choose in the comments section below this video. Also, tell me what you would name your final Fantasy Beatles album. First, a few rules. Since each of the Beatles albums have between 11 to 17 songs on them, except for the White Album, which had 30, this Fantasy album will have 14 songs on it, sort of an average. Also, we all know that Lennon and McCartney wrote the majority of songs on each Beatles album, but since this is their final album, I have to imagine that George, who was growing leaps and bounds as a songwriter, would have had an equal contribution on this final album. So, let's give Paul and John 4 songs each. Let's also give George 4 songs. And finally, let's give Ringo 2 songs. If you watch Peter Jackson's Get Back Beatles documentary, you'll see just how supportive Ringo was. He was the peacemaker in the band, so I don't think that he would mind only having 2 songs on this album. For the title of this Fantasy Final Beatles album, I'm going to call it Everest. I once read that the Beatles were going to name what eventually became the Abbey Road album Everest, and would shoot the album cover in the Himalayas, but the boys changed their mind. So I'm going to fantasize that they would have kept Everest in their back pockets and then use it for this final album. Perhaps Everest represents the Beatles reaching their highest peak. So here are my picks for the Beatles' Everest album. I've created a playlist in the description below this video if you'd like to hear these songs in order. I started the album with Band on the Run from the 1973 album Band on the Run by Paul McCartney and Wings. It's a great song with interesting musical changes, the kind of musical changes found on Sgt. Pepper's and Abbey Road, sort of multiple songs in one. The lyrics seem to be about being imprisoned and then escaping. That can be interpreted in many ways other than physically being in prison. Perhaps for Paul, the solo artist, that meant escaping the Beatles or escaping the stress of trying to run his company, Apple, with his bandmates. As for a Beatles song, I think that the concept still works. After all, the Fab Four certainly had plenty of experience being a band on the run, escaping crazed fans during their early Beatlemania days. My next pick is Just Like Starting Over from the 1980 Double Fantasy album by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. John must have wrote this about his relationship with Yoko. Despite any issues that they may have had in their past, John was looking forward to taking his relationship with her to the next level and enjoying their lives together. Lennon said in his last Rolling Stone interview in 1980, "All through the taping of Starting Over, I was calling what I was doing Elvis Orbison." If you listen carefully, the song definitely has hints of John sounding like Elvis Presley and Roy Orbison, 2 of his heroes. As a song on my Fantasy Final Beatles album, I like the optimism in the lyrics. Staying together to do another album would have been just like starting over. The third song I chose was My Sweet Lord from George Harrison's 1970 All Things Must Pass album. This song was a big hit for George, as was the album. It proved to the world that George was a talented songwriter, some would argue as good as John and Paul. With lyrics like Hallelujah and Hare Krishna, this song is obviously about Harrison's spiritual side. It's a bit repetitive, but like a religious mantra, it's quite effective and uplifting. I spent a lot of time analyzing song order on this Fantasy Beatles album, and this Harrison song feels really good in the third position. Next, I picked the song Photograph by Ringo Starr from his 1973 album Ringo. It's a very catchy song about losing someone you loved. All you end up with is their photograph reminding you of what once was, and it's devastating. It was a hit for Ringo. It fits nicely on this Fantasy Beatles album as song number 4. Ringo co-wrote Photograph with George Harrison, so it's a natural fit. My next song is Instant Karma, We All Shine On, released in 1970 by John Lennon, credited John Ono Lennon with the Plastic Ono Band. Instant Karma was written, recorded, and released within a period of just 10 days, which is pretty amazing. It was also recorded in just 10 takes. Produced by Phil Spector, it uses his signature wall of sound technique. It feels big. Notice the use of echo, especially on the drums. George Harrison and Billy Preston played on Instant Karma, so that gives it a lot of Beatles flavor. To me, the lyrics seem to be a message to people to take responsibility for their actions, and that doing the right thing can change the world in a positive way, and of course doing the opposite can cause harm. For my Fantasy Last Beatles album, it fits nicely as the 5th song. It's energetic and keeps things moving. It's also a nice bridge to the next song, Live and Let Die. Live and Let Die is the theme song of the 1973 James Bond film Live and Let Die. The song was written by Paul and Linda McCartney, and performed by Paul and his band, Wings. Wings' original drummer said the following about watching Paul write the song. He had just read the book the night before, and he started screwing around at the piano. Within 10 minutes, he had that song written. Live and Let Die was produced by longtime Beatles producer George Martin, so it feels good on my Fantasy Beatles album. Martin's contribution especially shines through in the orchestral parts of this epic song. All Things Must Pass. When thinking about compiling a Fantasy Beatles final album, I considered that the release would have been on vinyl. So to end side 1 of the record, I chose George Harrison's song, All Things Must Pass. In my opinion, it makes a good closer. It's from George's 1970 album of the same name. During the Let It Be sessions, George offered All Things Must Pass to the Beatles, but it didn't make the cut. That being said, if the Fab Four would have stayed together, I believe that they would have eventually recorded it. It's brilliant. Listening to this song after the breakup of the Beatles must have felt like George saying goodbye to the Beatles and moving on to his solo career. But the song also has a bigger message in my opinion, that life brings great highs and lows, and to not get caught up in the extremes. Maybe I'm Amazed. Side 2 of my Fantasy Beatles final album starts with Maybe I'm Amazed by Paul McCartney from his 1970 solo album simply entitled McCartney. It's one of my favorite Paul McCartney songs, said to be written about his late wife Linda, who loved and supported him while he was going through a difficult time. Paul was the sole singer and musician on this recording. He played the drums, piano, bass, organ, and guitars, which is pretty impressive. What would this song have sounded like if all 4 members of the Beatles performed on it? One can only imagine. This cut works great on my Beatles Fantasy final record because it begins a sequence of 3 songs from Beatle members singing about love. Woman. My next song is Woman, performed by John Lennon from his 1980 album Double Fantasy. The song lyrics appear to be an apology to, or an appreciation of John's wife Yoko. It follows Maybe I'm Amazed quite nicely, and gives the album balance. It also leads nicely to my next song choice. If Not For You. If Not For You completes the trilogy of love songs on my Fantasy Beatles final album. This song was written by Bob Dylan. George did his version of this song for his 1970 album, All Things Must Pass. Anyone that's ever been in love can relate to the lyrics, and George's arrangement is very good. I love Billy Preston's organ work, and apparently Peter Frampton played acoustic guitar in this song, along with George, which explains the solid guitar work. My next song is Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey by Paul and Linda McCartney from their 1970 album Ram. After hearing 3 love songs in a row, I needed to change things up. Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey is a fun song that has many parts. Producer George Martin came up with the orchestral arrangements, and I think that they are great. I love the use of sound effects on the song, like rain, wind, thunder, and birds. I also love the funny voices. Paul said that this song was an apology from the younger generation to the older generation. He also said that Uncle Albert was based on his real-life uncle. The Beatles were never afraid of experimentation and dabbling in different musical genres. This song feels good in the number 11 spot on this Fantasy Final Beatles album for those reasons. It Don't Come Easy. The 12th song on my Beatles' final fantasy album is It Don't Come Easy by Ringo Starr. He released it in 1971 as a non-album single. It was produced by George Harrison. This song brings my Beatles album Everest back to reality from Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey. It's a song that seems to be about struggling. For Ringo, perhaps that's the struggle to be relevant after leaving the Beatles. Luckily, Ringo proved himself and released a large body of work. Some songs, like It Don't Come Easy, were big hits. Isn't It a Pity by George Harrison is song number 13 of 14 songs on my Fantasy Final Beatles album. It's also from his 1970 album All Things Must Pass. George wrote this song in 1966 and presented it to the Beatles. They passed on it, which is crazy because it's an amazing song. The lyrics seem to be about how human beings hurt each other in relationships and the shame of that. There are 2 versions of this song and both are good. I picked the first version. It's 7 minutes long. I love how it builds and builds. It's one of George's best songs in my opinion. Imagine is the last song on my Beatles fantasy album Everest. It's from John's 1971 album Imagine. This song about imagining a peaceful world is one of John's best songs, perhaps even one of the greatest songs of all time. It's negative at times, pointing out all of the things that cause all of the problems in the world, but it also has a hopeful message that if all of the dreamers come together, perhaps the world will be as one. To me, it's hard to follow a song of this magnitude, so it had to end the album. Well, that's the end of my final Beatles album, made up of songs from the Fab Four solo catalog. I think it flows nicely and the songs are all very strong. I often wonder, what if all of the members of the Beatles were alive today? Would they record more masterpieces together? Thankfully, we have all of their wonderful albums and solo material. Now I'm curious to know what songs you would put on this fantasy album. What did I miss? Please tell me in the comments section below this video. Peace and love, everyone. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.